Imagine yourself up on the roof of Buckley House, one of the 3 multi-storey blocks on Union Street in town, built by the council in the 1960s. They're 7 storeys, a modest nod to the fashionable high-rise housing favoured by many councils in the day. Now, look all around Barnsley, to the nearby Kendry, Athersley, Worsborough and Lunwood estates, across to Hoyland, Cudworth, Royston, beyond to the Dearne Valley, and then further afield to the green hills and vales of Penistone and the west. As well as seeing our great town of Barnsley, with our industrial heritage and wonderful landmarks, you'll see the sweeping wide streets, large gardens and characteristic semi-detached houses, flats and bungalows of our council estates. These are places where people live their lives and raise families in the security that comes from having a warm, safe and decent home. But it wasn't always that way. This is the story of 100 years of council housing in Barnsley. During the Industrial Revolution, workers poured into Barnsley. Housing, struggling to keep up with demand, was overcrowded and insanitary. George Orwell described Barnsley when he visited in 1936. You lose yourself in labyrinths of little brick houses blackened by smoke, festering in planless chaos around miry alleys and little cindered yards where there are stinking dustbins and lines of grimy washing and half-ruinous WCs. In 1918, as the guns fell silent on the Western Front, imagine what our soldiers must have felt when they returned to the slums after giving so much for their country. The government responded to public unrest with Lloyd George's 1918 election speech, promising homes fit for heroes. And in 1919, the Addison Act, for the first time, gave councils the means to build housing on a massive scale. And the Barnsley Corporation triumphed over the general shortage of labour, lack of suitable land and the expense of materials, and began building the Barnsley of today. The first houses, under the Barnsley Corporation, were built at Racecommon Road, Gorber and Wilthorpe, while the urban district councils also pursued their own schemes at Ward Green, Carlton, Darton, Royston, Hoyland and elsewhere. Let's meet 93-year-old Cyril Hall, who's lived in his council house in Lunwood since 1926.
It was 14th of December 1926 when my dad got the keys, and he moved in next day because he was that glad to get out of lodgings, because there were a lot of people in that house at the time, because my uncle Jim and my auntie Emma and my dad's sister, they're a big family.
The age of the council house had arrived, and soon the face of Barnsley was beginning to change. Bit by bit, slum clearance programmes swept away the old cramped housing, with whole communities up in sticks and moving to new council houses on the estates springing up around Barnsley. For the first time, many people found themselves living in houses with indoor toilets, a bath and a garden. How must that have felt?
We used to have to go across road, across the backyard to the toilet, you know. And my dad, in winter time, my dad had said, don't forget to take a stick in case there's ice on top of water, you know, in the toilet. And then after that we got our council house, and then we thought it was bee's knees because we got a bathroom downstairs and a toilet inside, you know.
So from being 1 up to being 18, I lived in Semino Square. We could talk, there was a big hedge at the back of the house, and we could talk through the hedge to the people that lived on Gorber Road. It was nice, we knew them as well.
After World War II, Britain again faced a housing shortage, and new, faster building techniques were used to meet demand. Welcome the prefab. Barnsley built about 3,600 of the tin, concrete or wooden temporary homes. but temporary they were not, as 60 years later many of them still stand, much improved and still as popular.
But 7 years it took us to get a house, and that house was this new thing called a prefab. While we had electric and running water, we didn't have any hot water system or heating system apart from an old black leaded grate. And suddenly we were up in out in virtually the country in Common Lane in Royston, the other end of Royston, and there was an estate of about 40 prefabs. These prefabs were fabulous, but only in summer, because they had no central heating. It was a small stove type fire, but they did have electric, and they did have bathrooms, and we thought it was really good.
By the 50s, more than a third of Barnsley folk lived in council housing, and, with word spreading about the high standards, many more aspired to live in them, waiting their turn for new homes on the vast estates being expanded across our town. Pat Harley moved into her house in Athersley South in 1951, when she was just 6 weeks old. Let's hear from her and other residents whose lives have been changed by council housing.
At the time we was living in just one room up Buckley Street, and in this room we had to eat, sleep, wash. There was no running water. My mum had to fetch the water from other houses to be able to wash. And when my mum came out of hospital, equivalent of a health visitor today, actually came and looked at the living conditions and said it wasn't suitable, and that's when we got our house in Wingfield Road.
My parents moved on to Castlereagh Street because my granddad lived there, and they'd nowhere to go when they got married, because my mum and dad were both in the army, and they both came out of army, and that's the only place, because there was nowhere to live. And eventually they got a council house, which was fantastic. They were one of the first people to move in Athersley, on Laves Lane. First row housing, and they thought they'd got the world, you know.
And everybody knew everybody, you know. It was a wonderful environment to grow up in, yeah.
That's what my mum got it as, because we'd lived with, hadn't we, for 3 years. There were no problems, but we just wanted his own place. We'd got a daughter, so we were through to bits to get it, weren't we?
So we waited for a relet, which we got. We're on Station Road, 94 Station Road. When we got there, well, it was like living in a mansion.
We got a council house. They come to say we got a council house. Now my husband were hoping that it were going to be at Kendry, but it weren't. It were at Athersley, and it were lovely. It were a semi-detached, newly built. Nobody had lived in it. It had been built as an extra. There were 4 blocks, built as an extra, and we were chuffed to bits. We got it.
In '64 we moved into 38 Turners Close, a brand spanking new 3-bedroomed house with a separate toilet and a separate bathroom. No longer the tin bath in front of the hearth, but it was fantastic. I can remember it, and the fact that we got a television for the first time was incredible. We were moving.
Barnsley bucked the trend to build high, but in the 60s and 70s they started to build low-rise flats and open-plan estates. And they looked to care for their elders by building many sheltered schemes, such as Glebe Court at Tankersley and Pendon House in Penistone, where older folk could keep their independence but have companionship and security. But by the late 1970s, with almost 36,000 homes having been built, the heyday of building council housing slowed due to a change in political attitudes, a decrease in government funding, and the impact of the right to buy, which was introduced in 1980. The years that followed saw standards decline. Tenants and residents' associations formed to campaign for better standards. Barnsley had to fight for every penny to address the ever-worsening situation.
So I started working in Barnsley in the early 1990s in council housing as an estate management officer on Kendry. And what you could see was after 10 years of public funding cuts, the the difficulties that those estates and those homes were starting to experience. And that was common up and down the country. We had about 30 or so tenants associations operating across Barnsley, and they were very, very active in campaigning to try and get resources and funding to address some of those issues. So we were successful in getting some estate action funding for estate like the Cloughs, Crown, for Athersley, and working on redevelopment of those particular areas.
Started out, Barnsley responded well to the best value regime of the 1990s when we were called on to modernise, cut out waste, and we also entered an era of new government inspections. With the council, we developed partnerships with other registered providers who new built on council-owned land in order to offer an alternative social rented product to council housing at the time. We received funding from various sources to undertake some large regeneration and remodelling schemes, areas across the borough such as Kendry, New Lodge, Worsborough, Lungwood and Athersley.
In 2000, the Decent Homes Standard, along with a landlord duty to bring homes up to a minimum standard by December 2010, was introduced by the government. And so, in 2002, Barnsley Council set up Barnsley Homes, an arm's-length management organisation who, with their 2-star inspection, unlocked around £140 million, which brought its 18,500 homes up to modern standards by 2010. From plasterers and plumbers to finance and admin officers, dedicated rents and letting staff, as well as a small army of housing management officers, everybody plays their part in a service that's now more than maintaining homes. It's also about caring for the people in them.
For me, it's always about homes. Council housing about people having a home. I think that's incredibly important. What could be more important than having a home? I mean, it's really difficult if you don't live anywhere just to go to the doctor or the dentist or even to school. If you've got a job and no home, that's incredibly difficult. So for me, it really is about having a home.
I think social housing is important, and I think we should actually be saying council housing is important because it's about the person's home, it's where they live, but it's also the communities that they live within, and it impacts on everyone's well-being, how they feel, how they're going to get up in the morning, how they're going to react, and it's just so embedded in the well-being of a person's life. So I think it's really critical, and not everyone can always choose where they want to be, and council housing gives those opportunities to people.
Today's approach to social housing management is centred around partnership working with tenants, the council, the police, fire and health services, along with a whole host of voluntary partnerships.
Social housing is here to stay. There's no getting away from the fact that people won't always be able to buy. What we need to make sure is it fulfills a proper role, that it's housing that people aspire to, that people can be proud to be in the rented sector, just as they can be proud to be in the owner-occupier sector at the same time. And we need to make sure that we've got strong estates and strong communities, because what councils do, they don't just manage the housing stock, they work with those families who are in those houses. They work with those communities, and it's that kind of work that makes Barnsley the great place that it is.
We still look at certain parts of Barnsley as, you know, it was a council estate, but it's more than a council estate. It always was, but you know, it has become a community that birthed in a council estate, but is now just a proper thriving community in, you know, in the best possible way.
I think council housing is important for people in Barnsley because it gives them secure housing. They feel safe and secure in council housing.
So I'd like to think that in future we don't see a reduction in terms of the overall number of council homes. I'd like to think that that's held and, if possible, increased, because I think that's really what many of our communities need: good quality, affordable homes.
Almost a century after the first foundation stone was laid in Ward Green, council houses are being built again, with 136 springing up so far across the borough and 310 more bought. a far cry from the thousands built every year in the 20s and 30s, but still a small miracle in this tough financial climate. A miracle called effective management. For 100 years, council housing has served the people of Barnsley well, sweeping away slums, providing decent housing for working class people, keeping people safe and warm, creating opportunities, standing strong, surviving the political and financial challenges, changing and evolving to support and meet the needs of our modern society. But it's the people who live in council houses who've created communities of friends and families, old and young, places where people want to live, people who laugh and cry together, work, play and learn together, fall out and make up together, people who put their heart in council housing. So there it is. Let's raise a cheer for the council house and the tenants and another 100 years of council housing in Barnsley.
Council houses are a good thing, yeah, really, they really are a good thing. Especially if you are just starting out and you've no funds to buy a house. Definitely, where would we have been without them? Would we all be laid in sleeping bags on the road?
But it was a way to get the working classes into some sort of decent housing, you know, because they were filthy.
Yes, I'm a council house fan, really. I think there's a place for it and it should be there. So I think whoever Mr Addison was, thank you.
Best thing that ever happened on this bloody planet. Council houses.